You may not know me, I'm Jeremy Harrell. I'm the CEO of the conservative clean energy organization, ClearPath. We're excited to co-host today's briefing with our friends at the American Exploration and Production Council today. Before we really get kicked off here, I did want to thank the Science and Tech Committee team for hosting us today here in the hearing room. Today, we are going to focus on the United States, how the United States can maintain its competitive advantage on natural gas and the role that natural gas can play in a low-carbon global economy. The United States is the largest producer of natural gas in the world, and importantly, American producers are among the most efficient and cleanest producers across the globe. Natural gas is abundant, it heats our homes, it fuels our factories, it secures our power grid with 24/7 power. Truly, it's a resource driving growth across our economy. And we need American natural gas to provide energy security for America and our allies, reduce global energy emissions, and meet rising electricity demand. The way we see it, we have to leverage this advantage. And to maximize its long-term potential, we must invest in American innovation to address emissions across the natural gas supply chain. This includes ensuring that the U.S. industry, small and large companies alike, are working together to reduce methane emissions from their operations. And it includes working with the Department of Energy, NOAA, NASA, to accelerate monitoring and measuring technologies and strategies. And that's why we've convened some of the top minds in the industry here today. So first we'll hear from our event partner, the CEO of AXPC, Ann Bradbury. Then we'll turn to John DeBar, Managing Director of Low Carbon Technology at ConocoPhillips, who also chaired the recently finalized Natural Petroleum Council report on emissions, and will share some of the findings and solutions that it proposes. And then we'll bring in Alex Whittington, Director of International Affairs at Cheniere Energy, along with Ann and John for a panel discussion. Before I turn it over to Ann, a couple quick housekeeping items before we get started. The panel is closed to the press, so really important to underscore that. Lunch is at the back of the room. Please feel free to get up and snag a box as we get the conversation started. And then lastly, and most importantly, we all want to be resources to you, the policymakers and staff here in the room. We're here to answer any of your questions and to be a resource for you, not only today, but in the future. So don't hesitate to reach out and be thinking about questions that you want to ask this panel as we wrap up the panel discussion. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ann. Thanks, Ann.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that kind introduction and for facilitating today's event, which we're super excited to co-host with you today. By way of introduction, AXPC represents the leading onshore producers of oil and natural gas. ConocoPhillips is one of our members. Collectively, our companies produce over 60% of all the natural gas produced in this country. So we're super excited to talk about natural gas. We also produce a lot of oil too, but today's focus is natural gas. I'm going to run through these slides pretty quickly. This is just kind of a scene setter for John and for some of the other parts of the discussion that we will have today. So this clicker is, there we go. Okay, so first of all, hopefully everyone is well aware the United States is the single biggest producer of natural gas in the world. The United States alone produces about a quarter of all global natural gas in the world, and you can see that this is a relatively recent phenomenon, just over the last 15 years since the onset of the shale revolution. Notably, Russia is the next biggest natural gas producer in the world at about 15%. Oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. There we go. I know we have people from all over the country here, so just in terms of geography, the largest producing basin is the Appalachia Basin, so Ohio, Pennsylvania, West Virginia. The second biggest producer of natural gas is the Permian, so Texas, New Mexico, but really natural gas is produced all over the United States as well as offshore. And U.S. producers over the last 10 years have been dramatically driving down emissions from our operation. So since 2015, we've seen a 58% reduction in the GHG intensity of U.S. produced natural gas, and that statistic is according to an analysis by the Clean Air Task Force and Ceres environmental organizations. We've also driven down our GHG emissions by about 40% over that same time frame. And as you can see, it's been a steady year-over-year reduction. Okay, as a result, The US is now by far the largest producer at scale of low emissions natural gas. On the left side, you see where we are in terms of our emissions intensity, and of those companies to the left of us on that bar, we produce more than all of them combined. So when the world is looking for low emissions natural gas at scale, the United States is sort of the obvious choice there. So we like to say very proudly that oil and gas production and emissions reductions are not mutually exclusive. In fact, one enables the other. So as we became the world leader in oil and natural gas production, we also became the world leader in emissions reductions. And we did that because of natural gas in the power sector. So 60% of all of the emissions reductions in the power sector are because natural gas displaced higher emitting sources. And about 40% of those emissions reductions came from the deployment of renewables. And this is especially important as we look globally at the world and its sort of growing need for energy, especially around coal. So natural gas emits about half as much as coal, and the single greatest tool we have at our disposal is natural gas to displace those higher emitting sources. So we recently supported a study done by BRG, the Berkeley Research Group, to look at the emissions profile of US LNG around the world. And what we found was US LNG's carbon footprint was about half of coal in every international market studied. It was also significantly lower than Russian gas in every market studied. And what these emissions reductions translate into is somewhere between 150 and 400 million cars on the road every year. Sorry. So this just shows over time the huge increase in LNG exports that we've seen. We just started as an exporter of LNG in 2015. Oh, it looks like we had a little issue with the translation. Sorry about that. But in 2015, 2016 is when we first started exporting LNG, and we've been growing steadily ever since. And we export to dozens of countries around the world. And we've done this at the same time that we've been able to keep prices here in the United States low and stable. That orange line is US natural gas prices compared to the rest of the world. So we're incredibly proud of the role that natural gas plays in climate solutions, in the role it plays in powering our domestic economy as well. Next, you're going to hear from John DeBar with ConocoPhillips, who led the NPC study on natural gas. And I think what you'll hear is what they've learned in terms of additional ways that natural gas is going to continue to play a key role in emissions reductions, and what sort of policies and framework needs to exist in order to support that future. So with that, let me turn it over to our friend John DeBar.
Thank you, Ann, and thanks to the ClearPath folks and AXPC for hosting this event. I'm with ConocoPhillips Oil and Gas Company. However, for the purposes of today's presentation, I am the chair of the working group that produced the study for the National Petroleum Council, which is a federal advisory committee under the Secretary of Energy. So we cleverly put into our title the molecules of methane and CO2, and that's sort of the focus of our report, was on those two greenhouse gases. We were focused on reducing GHG emissions and a lot of recommendations on things that both industry, regulators, legislators, and researchers can do. And on the natural gas supply chain in the U.S., which is from the well to the industrial or power plant meter, or to the LNG delivery point. So by design, this study doesn't address the end-use combustion of natural gas by the customers. It's inside the value chain, which is, we think, is really well in control of the oil and gas sector to address. So I'm going to cover some of our key findings, and then I'll wrap up at the end to tell you how you can learn more. Important statistic is that at current production rates, there are over 100 years of natural gas resources in the U.S. Natural gas is the #1 source of energy and electricity in the U.S., and producing natural gas emits greenhouse gases, most notably about a third of the man-made methane emissions in the U.S. come from the natural gas supply chain. We received a study request from the Secretary of Energy. These actually transcend administration, so we started this with Secretary Brulette, and then it was Secretary Granholm that actually issued the study request for us. We convened a study team, and importantly, that study team was about 50% people that are not in the oil and gas sector. And we thought that was really important because we wanted to get a consensus view, but a consensus view from opposing viewpoints. And so we included a number of NGOs, think tanks, including ClearPath. We included people from the academic community, from tribal organizations that have some relationship to the oil and gas sector, and we came up with this package of consensus recommendations. One interesting anecdote is that the people that worked on this study, during the period of the study, published over 219 peer-reviewed technical papers on methane emissions. So we really had the experts in the U.S. working on this project. Came up with 38 recommendations in the executive summary and many detailed recommendations in each chapter. And we broke it out into the 5 tasks you see there. But one of the key points I want to emphasize is for the first time, an NPC study actually did a deep dive into the societal considerations and impacts of what we do. And we make some very specific recommendations in the study about what industry ought to be doing going forward in order to have the correct engagement with communities before and during any project. So we have 5 points in our vision. I'm not going to go through all of these in detail. There's plenty of detail in the report, but I'll unwind that in a moment to give you a few key recommendations. The headline, we always know you got to have an elevator speech. This is what the main takeaway from the report is. Largest source of primary energy production, crucial role in energy security, important role in economic security under all scenarios. So it doesn't depend on picking your preferred EIA scenario for natural gas supply demand. Our recommendations are valid under all scenarios. So I'm going to go straight to the answer. And the answer is, if you look at our most forward-leaning pathway of emissions reduction, you get a 70% reduction in methane and 33% in CO2 out to 2050, which was the time frame the Secretary asked us to look at. I'll go into a little more detail on where those come from, and you can see how those unfold in the details of the study. So we made a package of recommendations for industry and for our trade associations to take on. I won't unpack all of these, but I do want to give you just a couple of them. We think that industry really needs to take on engagement on regulatory education and best practices with small operators. Although a lot of large operators were involved in the study, we learned very quickly that we need to get the small operators to the table and get their input because their concerns were different than the large operators. And we very specifically addressed what the small operators' concerns were and incorporated recommendations to address them. The headline statistic there is 100 operators produce 80% of the natural gas in the U.S. The other 20% is produced by hundreds of smaller operators. And we literally had a guy that came to one of our meetings who owns one well, and he was thinking about buying a second one. So we really tried to incorporate that small operator input. We think that the area on societal impacts and benefits and community engagement, we found that there were some pockets of excellence out there, but we also see that there's a need for all of industry to engage with the community before they do a project to reduce GHG emissions and not afterwards. And then a big part of our collaboration work is through our trade associations and asking both the national and the state and local trade associations to be a convening authority to share information amongst operators and best practices. But it's not just industry and the related associations. We also have recommendations for many branches of government. And so you can see some of the highlights here, but I'll mention a couple that are important, and we'll talk about them during our roundtable a little bit more. We know there's a methane task force at the White House. We think there's a role there for harmonization across MMRV, measurement and verification of methane emissions. And I'll talk more about that during our roundtable. Durable policies. The key message on durable policies is that in order to attract both capital investment for emissions reduction and operator training and operator practices for emissions reduction, we like to see things that are not going to change, quite frankly, every 2 years. We like to see things that are durable, that are going to engage over the long term, so we can invest and train operators to deliver those over the long term, and not both add and subtract from the policy level. We also see there's an important activity for diplomatic efforts. And in fact, after I leave here, I'm going over to the State Department to brief the Bureau of Energy Resources on the content of the study as it affects the export of U.S. LNG, also U.S. pipeline gas to Mexico, but mostly LNG, and that is about the carbon intensity of U.S. natural gas and diplomatic support so that importing countries' regulators accept what we're reporting in the U.S. through our regulators. We'll do a deeper dive on market mechanisms. I'll talk more about that during our roundtable. And then finally, we think that there's an ongoing role for councils of excellence for community engagement practices. We know that the DOE is giving a lot of money in education on what that means, but we think that there's also some opportunity to share what those best practices are rather than just waiting for communities to think of them on their own. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and turn it over to Alex Whittington from Cheniere Energy.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just briefly before we go to the panel, we'll introduce you to Cheniere and what we do. We were the first U.S. company to begin large-scale exports of LNG from the lower 48 8 years ago, and since that point have risen to become the second largest operator in the world behind Qatar. We produce over 50% of all U.S. LNG exports, so roughly 12% of the world's LNG, and are also the largest buyer of natural gas in the United States. So because of that, because of our role, we play a really important role as a conduit between both producers of natural gas and consumers around the world. So we produce about 3,300 cargoes of LNG that have landed in 39 countries since startup. One of the things that John pointed out was the critical role that industry plays in climate and thinking about how we make U.S. natural gas and U.S. LNG the world's cleanest. A lot of the things that we're doing, you can see up here, we have a good number of partners in both the private sector, in the academic world, and in technology providers. We like to call our MRV program QMRV, Cubing Quantification. So we really worked upstream to better understand the methane picture in the United States across key basins, working in midstream too to understand what that looks like as that natural gas is moved from its production source to our liquefaction terminals on the Gulf Coast, and then to see what the shipping looks like as well. Before we started our partnership there, no one really understood the kind of the methane intensity component of shipping. So we've done quite a bit to better understand what we're talking about, and then use that information both for our customers and our producers to ensure that U.S. LNG can be the most sustainable burden that it can be. So I think I'll just start there, and then we can kind of open up the panel, if that works.
Awesome. Well, thank you, all three of you, and I think as you will probably see, we've got three of the foremost experts in this space, and so certainly please be thinking about the questions that you guys have. We're definitely going to leave some time here at the end of the panel discussion for you all to ask any questions you may have. And I'm going to kick it off a little bit focused on solutions and how do we deploy solutions. And I think one thing is clear across the energy sector, but particularly in this industry as well, is we need to significantly increase the rate of deployment of new technologies, of infrastructure, and the ability to really invest in American production here. And unfortunately, we have a regulatory system in this country that doesn't really look to aim to drive forward positive benefits. It's built in a way that's being frankly misused to block projects as a whole. And I'd be curious to get your all's perspective on kind of some of the top priorities within the reg reform or permit reform debate. There's some rumors on Capitol Hill that some new policy may be coming forward from policymakers on the other side of the Capitol. Obviously, the House has been working on permit reform really since day one with H.R. 1. And so maybe let's start with Ann and get some perspectives of priorities on the permitting side, and we can work down the panel.
Certainly. Yes, that's on. Okay. Great question. So permitting reform is something that we think a lot about. Infrastructure is one of the most effective ways that we can further reduce emissions is by having appropriate offtake capacity, pipeline capacity, and so it, not only will lower sort of energy costs for American families, but it will also help us lower our emissions profile by ensuring that we are able to transport and move our product in the most efficient way possible. In terms of our priorities, one of the things that we have been pushing for is looking at the standard of judicial review. We think this would benefit all forms of energy, but one of the problems that we've seen is sort of the ever-moving goalposts that courts put on some of the NEPA decisions out of the administration. And so we would like a clearer standard of review for what a court can and can't look at when they're sued by an activist third party looking to stop some of the infrastructure projects. So that's one piece. Another important piece for us is federal lands. We represent a lot of the production on federal lands, and you see really varying approaches to and inefficiencies in terms of production on federal lands. In some of the field offices, it takes a year to get an APD approved, whereas on private land, just across state line, it would take a matter of days, like 5 days. So streamlining the process on federal lands would be a huge priority of ours as well. Those are the two off the top of my head. We probably have more.
Awesome. Thanks, Ann. John?
So we did a pretty deep dive into the permitting issues during the course of the study, with the idea that delivering natural gas in the U.S. Supports energy security and the ability to get natural gas to consumers in a cost-effective way. We worked quite a bit with the state regulators, particularly the public utilities commissioners, who were very concerned about increases in cost of delivery of natural gas. So when we went in and looked at the market mechanisms and the durable policy part of our study, we said, well, those two things really fit together because you want to deploy capital and train people to do the jobs to reduce GHG emissions, but you also want to have that happen over a longer time period so that it is in fact durable, and that helps it be cost effective. One very specific area that we were not able to reach consensus on was how to deem community engagement sufficient. We really looked for a place where we could say, if you do this, that would be sufficient community engagement. We weren't quite able to get to that point, but we were able to give sufficient body of knowledge and information that an operator and a regulator can look at it and go, well, this is a pretty good objective standard for how much community engagement and how you go about doing it. And we think that adds to the durability of the decisions on records of decision. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd say that from our perspective domestically, we really think that LNG exports have had a tremendous number of positives for communities across the United States. On the economic front, the security, the energy security front, and also on the environmental and air quality front. And if you look at the efforts to combat climate change globally, it absolutely has to be a kind of a global fight. And when we look at what's happening in terms of emissions and utilization of fuel sources around the world, global emissions from coal reached all-time highs for the last 3 years. So the narrative that coal is leaving the global energy picture is simply not true. 70% of coal usage is across the Indo-Pacific. And as we look forward, we believe that natural gas via LNG represents an incredibly critical and important tool for air quality, for energy security, and for climate issues. And there's no other market that's better positioned to produce and export that LNG than the United States. So for us, that kind of drives what we do and drives our broader thinking of where the market is going to go between now and the middle part of the decade. The demand for energy across the Indo-Pacific strong and growing. It's going to be met some way, and we believe that natural gas is the cleanest and most effective way to do that.
Alex, to stick on that topic, I think overwhelming message we heard from all three of you all is the role that American natural gas has played in global emissions reductions as a whole, and you can underscore a little bit of the opportunity, some of the global market. Can you touch a little bit on the LNG pause that the Biden administration has implemented and been conducting a study on, and how that's impacted your operations and more broadly the global push here?
Yeah, sure. So for us, we began operating in 2016. We operate the two largest export facilities in the United States, one in Louisiana, one in Texas. For us, the pause isn't impacting what we're doing. Our Corpus Christi, Texas project That expansion is under construction. We'll hopefully get first gas out of that this year. And then we have 2 other expansion projects that we're looking to FID in 2025, 2026. So as long as the pause is a pause, we don't anticipate the pause is going to impact us and our project timelines. So from a personal, selfish perspective, it's not impacting us. But in general, I think after 8 years of safe and reliable operations, from our perspective, we think the benefits of LNG are very, very clear for the United States. And as I mentioned earlier, for climate progress, for global security, for energy security of partners now. So I think we're kind of concerned there might be some unintended supply and demand consequences to the pause. Kind of concerned that it might impact the reliability and the perception of reliability of U.S. LNG. And then also from the kind of investment side, some concern that it would impact the investment certainty kind of for projects in the United States. So I think there are a number of unintended potential consequences from the pause that we might see. So we'll just see how the whole pause progression works out in terms of the studies the pause are going to release, and then how that impacts the timeline. And I think that's really going to ultimately determine the broader long-term impact the pause would have on our industry.
John, you talk a lot about regulatory and policy certainty. This is obviously an example where some uncertainty was injected. Do you want to touch a little bit on the pause as well?
Yeah, so the pause was announced when we were pretty far along in the study. So the guidance that we got was don't redo the study to specifically address the pause, but rather to highlight for DOE where elements of our study findings and recommendations are supportive of reaching a decision on the pause. And I'll give you 4. I mentioned community engagement already. I'm not going to rehearse that again. We think that is clearly aligned with the questions that the Secretary raised in the pause announcement. One of the key contractual relationships that the U.S. LNG business has, which is unlike many other countries, is that our businesses don't include what are called destination clauses. Many other LNG exporters say, if you buy my LNG, you can't send it anyplace else without my approval. So we think that the flexibility in the U.S. LNG export market aids in achieving energy security. But we think that there's an important aspect of U.S. LNG exports that we've incorporated, and I'll be talking with the State Department about today, which is the DOE's MMRV framework for exports. We've added to that and said there should actually be a standard for the carbon intensity measurement of U.S. Natural gas, including LNG, by correlating the top-down measurements and bottom-up measurements at individual sites and individual assets, so that when a buyer abroad is buying our LNG, they don't have to go, yes, we want your LNG, but it has high carbon intensity. We want that to be addressed through both the MMRV efforts in the U.S. and the diplomatic efforts of the State Department. Thank you.
I want to unpack a little bit what you just said there, but first let Ann, give Ann an opportunity to talk a little bit about the impact of the pause to her members.
Yeah, so, I was hosted a luncheon last week in Milwaukee with an LNG exporter, one of which their facility is fully permitted and the other is not fully permitted. And so I asked, for sort of an emerging exporter, like what's been the impact of the pause? And they said there's literally not a single aspect of their business that has not been impacted by the pause, because it, I think, has raised a number of questions from, the financing community, from the customer community, the international community, about the reliability of U.S. LNG moving forward. And so, I think what I would say is to echo, if the pause is just a pause, I think this is something we are all going to get through. If the pause results in greater uncertainty about the reliability of U.S. LNG moving forward, about the standards under which LNG export licenses will be approved moving forward, and it changes that standard significantly, or it introduces this question about the sort of politicization of LNG export approvals moving forward, that's going to have a huge impact on industry and eventually on producers. So I think what happens next is going to matter a lot. And I would just sort of call out a bill that the House has passed a couple times now, which is the bill to remove the DOE approval process for non-FTA licenses from the process and put it in FERC, an independent agency. And I would say that's something that, we think would be super helpful. Crude exports, most exported products don't have to go through that additional hoop, which has now introduced this level of politicization and uncertainty, which doesn't need to be there. So kudos to the House for passing that bill, and would love to see that solidified, to sort of remove that question of reliability moving forward.
Makes a lot of sense. We talked a little bit about the global market opportunity and global demand for a lower carbon product, and I think all three of you touched a little bit on the U.S.'s carbon advantage as an efficient low carbon producer here. Maybe starting with Alex, I'd be curious to get his thoughts on Cheniere, obviously the largest LNG exporter in the country. How do you put together a package to show folks and ultimately show that it's a low methane intensity or low emission intensity product and really tap that kind of global demand that's looking for the lower carbon product that the U.S. is so apt at producing?
Yeah, thank you very much. So a number of the things that we've done for our customers, one is our cargo emissions tags that we started in 2022. So for every cargo that we sell our partners, we basically give them all the information, the GHG kind of equivalent. It helps them for their own kind of internal carbon budgeting and provides greater transparency. And that's built on our own LCA, our life cycle analysis of our own kind of footprint that we've developed in conjunction with data from U.S. national labs, and we're refining it over time. That LCA was peer reviewed and published. So all of the data that underlines it is publicly available. And what that LCA essentially shows is that when you're looking at the use of coal for power production in Northeast Asia versus LNG cargo, there's a roughly 50% savings in terms of GHG equivalents. And just to put it in perspective, the broader Indo-Pacific is the primary market for LNG. Currently, roughly 70 to 75% of all LNG in the world lands in Asia. The world's largest buyers are there, and going forward, we expect that to be the case. So while we have buyers in Europe, for instance, that are very focused on sustainability and the cleanliness of where that LNG is coming from, there are also buyers that just need reliable and affordable energy, and particularly in LNG across the Indo-Pacific. And they're just looking to get their hands on as much supply as they can. And we really expect the global market to grow fairly dramatically between now and 2040. The global market is roughly 400 million tons of LNG, give or take, right now that's traded on an annual basis. We expect by 2040 that demand is going to be close to 700 million tons of LNG. We know where a lot of that demand is going to come from. South Asia, Southeast Asia, China, almost all across the Indo-Pacific. We know where some of that demand is going to be met from the projects that are being FID, that are being built. There's a huge slice of that future demand that we don't know where it's going to come from. And that's really kind of the question that's confronting the market as we speak. If you would have asked us in early 2022, we would have told you the three major basins that are going to supply the world's future needs are North America, Qatar, and Russia. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Russia question has been completely thrown in terms of how sanctions will impact production, how buyers will think about purchasing Russian gas and LNG. And there hasn't really been a really clear alternative that the market is going to determine. So there really is a question, is where is the world's future LNG demand going to be met from? Obviously, we know that the United States will continue to grow much larger. Canada, so North America will be a huge source of global LNG. Same with Qatar. But other than that, the real question becomes, where does that future demand come from? And that's what the industry, I think, is confronting. And not all projects are created equally. As you know, the regulatory kind of regime in the United States is very clear in terms of the reporting and the data that flows into that process. It's not the same in other markets around the world, and that's the real question. How do you differentiate U.S. LNG from other production sources? And it's a really important issue for our industry, but also for confronting climate and how you think about climate change and emissions globally.
One of the issues that was briefly, let's say, in-depth explored in the NPC study was on emissions related to the LNG facilities themselves, and I know you all have been pioneering efforts to really invest in that realm. Can you talk just a little bit about what Cheniere is doing on that front and how you can mitigate some of the impacts of those export activities?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of things that you can do on they're both looking at the broader kind of power production component of how we produce our facilities, looking at what waste heat recovery can look like, thinking about project expansions and how that fits into CCUS. So kind of looking at all of those things is what we're doing, and then developing our climate goals that are based on kind of an accurate and I'd say holistic assessment of the entire value chain and how our liquefaction facilities kind of fit into that. So I think the slide I showed earlier showed a number of the partnerships that we have on the technology front and on the QMRV front, and then figuring out how our expansions can fit into that, utilize that data and information to ensure that what we do is the cleanest way we can do it.
Ian, you had a really compelling study in your presentation talking about the effort that American producers are doing today to reduce the emissions impacts of their operations. Can you talk a little bit about the technologies and processes that they're using on the ground to detect and mitigate methane emissions, and where you think there's some more opportunities to continue to leverage this advantage of American production?
Yeah, absolutely. So American producers are committed to continually reducing emissions from their operations. I think it's interesting to note that those emissions reductions are taking place year over year, regardless of who is in the White House. And so that's something that industry is really committed to. One of the things that's really interesting about this challenge of emissions reduction is the really varied landscape under which this production is taking place. So the Permian looks very different from the mountains of Pennsylvania, which looks very different from North Dakota, in February and negative 30-degree weather, right? And so there's not a one-size-fits-all technology to address, measure, and mitigate emissions, right? And so what you're seeing right now is a really complex ecosystem of different technologies where companies are working to figure out which works best for which facilities. And those technologies include satellites, it includes flyovers, it includes drones, it includes monitoring on the ground. It's a really complex ecosystem, and companies sort of use a cocktail of these approaches to really understand what their emissions profile is. And so, the two big takeaways is that this technology is the best in the world. It is rapidly evolving, and there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to the best way to measure, monitor, and reduce emissions based on, operations location, age of the facility, geographic considerations. But it is a really exciting space and one that we are continuing to pioneer and we're really excited about.
John, methane monitoring and measurement and verification technologies was a central focus, one of the big pieces of the recommendations, the NPC report that you provided kind of in that closing overview there. Can you talk a little bit about the technologies and why they're so important, and do you agree with Ann that there's no one size fits all, that it's a mix of methods across the domestic industry?
Yeah, first I agree with Ann. Our research really shows that there is no one size fits all. We were actually asked by DOE to give us the optimized stack of technologies. We really tried to find that, and there isn't one stack. It's really different based on the atmospherics, on the topology, on the types of equipment. What would work well at a Cheniere facility would not work well on a well pad in North Dakota. Two other really important points I want to reinforce. First is that a lot of the methane emission technology that Ann's members, our company, uses came out of the national laboratories. And so there's a recommendation in there about additional funding for DOE for the National Laboratories Complex to address some of the really core ways of improving both the measurement, detection, but especially the quantification efforts. The second is that we learned very quickly, and we ran some really good experiments during the course of the study with many, many technology vendors. It's pretty easy to detect methane in the air, but by the time it's already in the air, you have to then go figure out where is that emission coming from so you can eliminate it. So it was not measure everything everywhere all the time. It was measure it enough so you can find it and stop it. And all the other data that needs to be pulled in, particularly operational data, process control data, to say, I've detected a methane emission that I was not expecting, who's going to go out there and fix it, and what are they going to do? So those were the key messages. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. We are reaching transitioning towards the last 15 minutes here, I want to make sure that we have some time for Q&A. It's going to be one or two last questions. And John, I'm going to ask one last question. I'm going to close out the conversation about the NPC study, at least until I'm sure we get some more questions there. But you laid out the diverse group of stakeholders there, and ClearPath was one of those, and Karen Obenchain on our team, and then the back right over there is our gas expert, and she was our lead at the MPC study. But I'd just be curious to get your experience leading this study as a whole. Many of the recommendations were consensus-based, and how were you able to navigate, and how difficult was it to navigate bringing industry, NGOs, other stakeholders across the supply chain together on some unified recommendations, and what does that mean, I think, for as we look to next steps and trying to move some of those recommendations forward?
Yeah, so first, the recommendations and findings were all consensus, so there was no voting criteria. Everything was consensus, which meant we worked them until we could get agreement on them. It also meant that nobody was completely happy. Everyone was a little disgruntled that they didn't get everything that they wanted. The other thing I learned, and sort of the behavioral economics thing, was the good stuff, the easy stuff, we could take care of over a Zoom call. The really difficult problems were in person. And so we had a monthly in-person mandatory meeting, and that's where we worked the consensus recommendations. It also took a lot of deep dive, personal effort by the people on the study to get with the individuals or the organizations that had very specific requirements. And one of them, for example, were the tribal organizations. In many cases, they felt that they had not really been represented, not really been heard. So we're like, what is really important to you? Let's really dig down into it. Not from a sort of headline advocacy standpoint, but from a what needs to be done and what help do you need. And we make some very specific recommendations on things that not everyone was concerned about, but they were important enough from a methane emission regulation standpoint that we made some recommendations in support of helping the tribal entities.
One last question before we turn it over to Q&A. Excuse me. I want to talk and reinforce the conversation on regulatory certainty and market mechanisms that can ultimately support action and grow American gas production and ultimately the role it's playing in the global picture. As we look towards the coming months here, what are some of the single largest things that producers or the industry as a whole is thinking about as we go into the coming years here, and how do we ensure that the executive branch and Congress ultimately are providing that kind of durability of policy and such moving forward? Maybe start with Ann on that front.
Great. So first, I'll talk about methane because we talk a lot about methane regulations in our association, and we kind of look at it as a three-headed beast. So there is the Quad O regulation of methane, which was recently finalized in May. This is sort of the federal standard on methane. It is a final rule at this point, and it could be a lot worse, but it does have some unintended consequences, and so those unintended consequences are being worked out and potentially litigated with the EPA right now. But getting some sort of final changes and or tweaks, if the administration were to change, would be a very high priority for my organization, for the upstream industry. I think certainly. A lesser known methane regulation that I think is incredibly important is Subpart W. Subpart W is how American producers show their math. It is our disclosure statements in terms of our emissions. So the EPA has the most transparent emissions inventory in the world, and it is based on these things called Subpart W factors. And EPA is currently revising those Subpart W factors. Those also recently became final. Those are also likely going to be litigated because while there are some important improvements in terms of how those emissions are calculated, in terms of getting more accurate, there are also some that are now much less accurate and will actually disincentivize true progress in terms of emissions reductions. For example, it sort of sets a flare standard that's much lower than the average flare standard. So why are you then incentivized to go higher, or to even if it is higher, you can't take credit for that. And then thirdly would be the natural gas tax, the methane tax, which was part of the IRA. We have some concerns with the methane tax to begin with. We have some additional concerns about how the EPA is implementing it. So getting that right and or repealing the methane tax so that we can spend our energy actually reducing emissions in the most effective way possible would be something we would be strongly in favor of. So that is where we spend a lot of our regulatory focus. There's certainly other agencies that we work on as well, but that's what I would highlight for you all today.
Thanks, Dan. John, what are you watching closest?
So every National Petroleum Council study in the past has always come up with the one solution, which is we need an economy-wide price on carbon. I was given guidance from my study leadership and Deputy Secretary Turk that don't come back with that simple answer again. So we did a deep dive into different kinds of market mechanisms, both regulatory and voluntary market mechanisms. Regulatory ones are things that you would be familiar with, like low carbon fuel standards or portfolio standards. The voluntary carbon standard reductions mechanism were really an interesting study because you think it's voluntary. How could that be a market mechanism? Well, an example of that is when a company makes a commitment to be net zero by 2050. Well, that's a commitment, and everything about that company's behavior gets baked into that commitment. So that actually is an example of a market mechanism that is voluntary. So we looked at it and said, well, how can we both encourage regulatory market mechanisms that incentivize the right behaviors, the deployment of capital, and the training of personnel, but also recognize that voluntary market mechanisms can provide something beyond what the regulation actually requires. So that was a big part of the study. It's a deep dive. You can read about it in the study about the different parts of the market mechanisms.
I think this is a really important thing, and why folks should spend some time diving into the study and telling, like in the end, they didn't say come back with a thing that Congress has rejected year after year over the last decade. What are some of the really important things that we could do across the policy spectrum to really drive and reinforce Americans, or the U.S.'s low carbon advantage in production here? And so we really encourage folks to take a deep dive, at least in the executive summary. It's a lot of important work. Go ahead, John.
I'd like to add an additional point, Jeremy, and that is, Ann alluded to the subpart W factors. One of the key parts of the study we found is that there is a benefit from being able to correlate how those particular factors apply to what is actually being measured at a location, and how you correlate what happens on the ground with what might happen from overflights. So we receive every quarter Alex's package of here's ConocoPhillips report on your cargo tags. But that's based on the subpart W factors. And there's sort of no mechanism for changing those because they're written into the rule, into the regulation. So we made a deep dive in the study about MMRV and about correlation methods to correlate what an individual company might measure with what might come from an overflight, how we correlate those two.
Alex, we'll give you the last word before we get to Q&A.
Yeah, so regulatory is certainly, of course, really important, but I'll throw out another fun issue that we can all think about. So building an LNG export facility is exceptionally expensive, and as compared to our state-owned and state-run competitors outside the United States, we finance our facilities via debt and equity markets, and the DPO's capital markets are critical. But it's expensive. It's getting more and more expensive. So I think as we look at what 2025 is going to bring, I think we're paying very close attention to U.S. trade policy and how trade and tariff policy will impact the cost of material inputs in the United States. And I don't think that there's enough focus on that and how that could potentially impact how much it costs to build an LNG export facility, but also how those trade policies, no matter who's in the White House, can impact our trade relationships with partners around the world. So I think it's important to think about that too.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of talk about U.S. trade policy on both sides of the executive branch spectrum there. So really important issue to continue to be tracking. All right, we've got about 10 minutes left here, and so we want to turn it over to Q&A. So if you've got a question, you raise your hand. It's here in the front. We'll have you kick start. Could you introduce yourself as well?
Dave Straka with the Times Been White Turner's office for a while. So we talked a lot about methane, actually, and we've seen that the export clause is likely influenced by some papers comparing the methane leakage intensity to carbon intensity of coal in Europe. How does the National Petroleum Council report ensure the American people and our allies have reliable information as the world considers the geopolitical impact? Mostly for John, but feel free to weigh in.
So the scope of the study didn't include a comparison of U.S. natural gas with other energy sources. So we did not do a gas on coal comparison. We didn't compare US LNG to Russian pipeline gas, to Silesian lignite, to wind and solar. It was purely, if someone is going to buy US LNG, what can industry and regulators do to reduce the GHG intensity of that natural gas and report it accurately? One of the key points, and Alex started to discuss this a little bit, is when we use life cycle assessments. A life cycle assessment is a tool that allows an operator or a seller of natural gas to do an accurate calculation of the carbon intensity of that natural gas from its wellhead to its delivery point. The Cheniere model is a superb piece of software, but one of the things we learned is that it sort of takes an Obi-Wan Kenobi level of knowledge to run a life cycle assessment model. So we, as part of the NPC study, produced and have put into the public domain a fit-for-purpose life cycle assessment model that allows an operator to produce their own carbon intensity calculation and include their own measurements of their methane intensity into their carbon intensity. And that's an area where we are encouraging, especially on the diplomatic front, but also DOE through its work on a MMRV framework with international buyers, a government-to-government consultation, to say, use this tool and use this mechanism to report on the carbon intensity of U.S. natural gas.
I think it's why data transparency and third-party verifiable data is so critical, to have a real database holistic view of LCA for U.S. natural gas. And like our LCA was published in peer review. I think that's critical. You see other voices that have alternative explanations for what LNG does and doesn't do, and oftentimes those aren't peer reviewed, right? And those don't have really verifiable data sets. I think it's critical to look at all of this from a very scientific standpoint to really get the best and the most complete picture of what we're doing and why.
Great question.
I'll
yeah,
add real quick. So we actually right around the time of the NPC study also released a study that we supported that Berkeley Research Group did, the BRG, and we looked at. So it was a very academic study. They looked at from the life cycle analysis of U.S. gas basin by basin to 13 different export markets, which comprise most of the large export markets, and then compared it to coal and Russian piped gas, and found that in every single market, U.S. LNG had a much lower emissions footprint than coal in every market, from every basin, across the board. And we've talked to DOE about that. They were very interested in the study. We've talked to State Department about it. So I think the more studies and the more credible peer-reviewed data that we get out there, the better, because the one you're referencing is not peer-reviewed and it's not terribly credible, but it is getting some attention.
We've got time for a couple other questions. Yes.
So, Taylor, Western Caucus, Rystad came out with a study a year or two ago that showed onshore reinvestment rates since the shale revolution, and the study kind of concluded that at the height of the shale revolution, we're seeing investment rates of 110%, and right now we're seeing reinvestment rates of somewhere between 8 and 10, which is really, really low. And so, I think the reason for that is just uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty. We don't know what's going to come for the industry in the future, and people are hesitant to invest. I think conservatives have been beating the drum of judicial review, mandatory leasing to help ease some of that uncertainty. But I'm curious your guys' thoughts on just kind of reinvestment as a whole, and if it's worth Congress kind of drawing attention to that, being like, hey, this is going to be a big problem in 5, 10, 15, 20 years when companies aren't reinvesting at rates that gave us the shale revolution in the first place.
Good question.
The NPC study didn't look into that at all.
First I'll say that the reinvestment rates at the height of the shale revolution were not necessarily sustainable from a business model perspective. And so that is one of the reasons you've seen a shift. Certainly there's an enormous amount of regulatory headwinds that increase uncertainty, that drive up costs, especially on federal lands. And you see a shift in where that capital is deployed because there's a lot more certainty on private lands than on federal lands. I would also add, though, that another component of that is the incredible increase in efficiencies that operators are getting out of their drilling operations. What one well produces today is, probably triple or quadruple what it produced in sort of the beginning of the shale revolution. And the lateral, we're setting new records for laterals drilled. We're setting new records for just energy produced per well as companies look to make their operations more and more efficient. So I would say it's a complicated question and regulatory uncertainty is certainly a piece of the answer, but it's not the only answer.
We have time for one more quick question before we wrap. Going once. Going twice. All right, well then I think we will wrap. I would just really like to thank our great panelists today. It was a really insightful conversation, and truly three of the experts in this space and folks who are really on the ground making U.S. natural gas the immense resource it is both for our country and the globe. Whether it's exported LNG as a cleaner fuel to our allies, whether it's U.S. gas used to power our electricity system, American manufacturing, or even heating, it's clear the world's going to need more clean American natural gas. And so I'm excited to hear about some of the opportunities in American innovation, in regulatory certainty and clarity, in transparency, monitoring and verification, really can play a role in continuing to leverage this immense American resource. And so thank you all for having lunch with us. Thank you all for joining us. And let us know if we can be a resource for you. As you all look to seize opportunities in the coming Congress. So thanks everybody.
Thank you.